The coronavirus outbreak has disrupted economic activity worldwide. As a result, most governments faced two problems: a decrease in budget revenues due to lockdown measures and an increase in government expenditures to contain the spread of the virus and support households and businesses.
In Denmark, this led to an increase of the debt-to-GDP ratio from 33 to 42% in 2020. The reasons are a drop in GDP and a budget deficit of 1% to pay for the support measures.
Is the rise of Denmark's debt ratio to 42% problematic? And should the government therefore reduce its public debt to the pre-crisis level by running budget surpluses?
To evaluate this, we have to look at three main influencing factors of government budget planning: the level of the key interest rate, the domestic inflation, and the Danish current account balance.
Currently, the Danish key interest rate is at an all-time low of 0%, which means that the Danish government can borrow money at zero cost. This means that the level of debt to GDP doesn't matter whether it is 42% or higher, as the interest rate paid is zero. However, what would happen if the central bank increased the key interest rate? And why might this be a problem for the Danish government?
The current debt of Denmark has to be refinanced at some point by a new loan. If the interest rate rises in the meantime, the government has to pay more for the same amount of debt than before. This would increase the share of interest rate payments within a fixed government budget and therefore leave less room for discretionary expenditures.
But how realistic is an increase in the Danish central bank's key interest rate in the near future? To analyze this, we have to look at the current level of inflation, because the central bank sets its interest rate in accordance with the domestic inflation it wants to achieve.
For example, an above-target inflation in Denmark would mean that the Danish central bank would have to increase its key interest rate to dampen inflation and bring it within its desired range, which in turn would increase future borrowing costs for the government, since it has to pay a higher interest on its debt service.
However, in Denmark, inflation is around 1%, which is below the central bank's target level of 2%. This means that the central bank has no incentive to raise interest rates, which allows the Danish government to continue borrowing at the current interest rate of 0%. This leaves us with the last factor we have to consider: the current account.
As we can see, Denmark has run a current account surplus for the last decade. Thus, Denmark exports more than it imports. In other words, Denmark saves more than it spends. This implies that the government could fund its debt by domestic investors only. This is beneficial for three reasons. First, domestic investors are less timid than international ones, especially in times of crisis. Second, domestic investments are subject to the legal framework of Denmark, which allows the government to keep some influence. Third, a rise in interest rates would not lead to a loss of interest revenue to international investors, but remain in Denmark.
Overall, we see a current account surplus helps the government fund its budget deficit without depending on international investors. This makes the debt more sustainable and allows Denmark to increase it even further.
To sum everything up, there is no reason for Denmark to reduce its public debt by running a government surplus. Denmark should rather make use of the low borrowing cost and engage in a higher debt, as it faces a 0% interest rate, low inflation, and a current account surplus.